This is our first ever live session. This is a new feature with Substack, which we're really excited about. It gives us a way of communicating directly with all of you. Stealthing in from work, love it. Yeah, we didn't know when to time it, so we thought a lunch break would work. Hi, everyone. Hi. Okay, I'm going to get going. The way this is going to work, firstly, is that I'm just going to do a bit of an introduction. I'm going to share a few thoughts for about 15, 20 minutes. Then we're going to open up for questions and discussion. If you're watching this later on, after the live discussion, if you're watching it on Substack, we're going to send this out to our founding and paid subscribers. Thank you for your support. It's really appreciated. We're doing these live sessions so we can stay connected with our committed supporters and we can have a closer relationship. If you're also watching this at a later date, so after founding and paid subscribers have got it, but if you're watching us at a later date on things like YouTube, then obviously hit like and subscribe. But this is primarily something that is for our founding and paid subscribers only. To say thank you to them for their support. What I want to do over the next 15, 20 minutes is offer some thoughts on the Conservative Party leadership campaign, the candidates, what we're witnessing in terms of the Conservative Party's attempt at renewal. I want to talk a little bit about the Reform Party, what I picked up at the conference, just some kind of private thoughts about where that party is going and the demand and potential for it. I want to talk about Labour, the Labour Party, the start of the Labour Party government, Keir Starmer's and polling. And then we're going to open up for some questions, discussion from all of you. We have decided to do this at lunchtime because we wanted people to be able to come in. We thought doing it in an evening would eat into your time with family and so on, and we were kind of conscious about that, but we're open to suggestions later on. So let's get going with the agenda. Conservative Party leadership race, Reform, Labour polling, a few other things. Okay, so Conservative Party leadership race. Here's what I think. The starting point in terms of who is running for the race is why people didn't vote Conservative in 2024. Now, I'm about to publish something tomorrow, an exclusive survey just for you guys, founding paid, on I think we've got about 2,000 people that voted Conservative in 2019 and didn't vote Conservative in 2024 and why they left the party. The big reason you'll be shocked to hear was migration. Levels of legal migration too high, losing control of the borders. Now, it wasn't only about migration, but primarily it was. And the other thing to say, by the way, on that is when you hear leadership candidates talk about the importance of things like competence, which is a buzzword at the Conservative conference in Birmingham. I think we need to remind ourselves what we mean by competence, because for most of the people that voted Conservative and then left the Conservatives, that competency isn't just bland competence. It is about competency at managing the issues they care about. And the most important at the moment is migration, okay? So that's the starting point. If you look at where the Conservative vote went at the last election, a quarter of that Conservative vote went to Reform. There is absolutely no question that Nigel Farage and the Reform Party pose the biggest existential threat to the Tories. Now, much of the commentariat and the pollsters who are, let me be direct, invested in the status quo would have you believe that the main challenge for the Conservatives is winning back the Liberal Democrats or winning back Lib Dem voters. Is bananas. That's not true. The biggest threat to the Conservative Party by a long way is the Reform Party. So the number one challenge for whoever becomes leader is to try and win back the quarter of voters who went Conservative to Reform. Now, tomorrow I'm going to be showing you what those voters really care about. And I'm also going to be showing you why I don't think they're going to be coming back anytime soon. But that's the starting point. Now, if you look at the people who are standing, Tom Tugendhat, James Cleverly, Robert Jenrick, Kemi Badenoch, here are my really honest views on those four candidates, okay? And this is between us. I'm sure it might leak out, but let me just be really honest with you. I actually don't think any of them have what it takes to rebuild the Conservative Party electorate. I really don't. I think they are sub-average, generic candidates. I really don't think they have what it takes to rebuild and renew the Conservative Party brand. I think Tom Tugendhat would be a gift for Nigel Farage and Reform. He'd give them enormous, even bigger, a bigger amount of space than they already have, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. I think One Nation Tories love him for a reason, because he reflects One Nation liberal conservatism. I don't think he would stand a chance at rebuilding the realignment. I think James Cleverly, I think his speech was okay. I don't think it was what much of the commentariat think. I think he seems like a nice, charming guy. I think he's too soft on immigration. He's too soft on the ECHR. I think his claim that he was the guy that reduced net migration is preposterous. I don't think he genuinely sees it as an overriding priority, and I don't think he'll do what needs to be done to regain control of the borders. I think Kemi Badenoch is really interesting on equalities and diversity issues. James Esses, who writes for us, outlined his view that he thinks Kemi is a significant person in that regard. I don't personally think she's prime ministerial. I don't think she is a leader in the sense of the word that the Conservative Party needs. I think she's potentially a competent minister. I don't think Nigel Farage and Reform would feel threatened at all by Kemi Badenoch. I do not think she would win the Red Wall. I do not think she would put back together the realignment. I don't think she has enough charisma. I don't think she sees legal migration as a priority. And I can't say too much beyond that, but I'm pretty confident that she doesn't see it as a priority in the same sense that I think other people in British politics do. I think she prioritizes illegal migration, but I don't think she gets the legal migration thing. And Robert Jenrick, look, I think he's saying some good things. If you notice what he's saying on the small boats, it's basically exactly what I advocated in the short film that we did. Leave the ECHR, reform the Human Rights Act, and have an active deterrent. I agree with him on that. I think he's correct. I think he is absolutely spot on in Hamas and the issues that he's talking about there. I think there are some very big known unknowns, however. I'm not sure he gets the woke stuff. He's given some very mixed messages on that. He's urged people not to fall into the trap of the culture wars. Sorry, but they're not culture wars. The rights of women, the rights of our children, the rights of British people to defend their history, their identity, their ways of life. These aren't culture wars. These are the foundations of our civilization. These are the things we should be fighting for. I think his messaging on that has been off. And it's not so much a criticism, but there's an authenticity issue with Jenrick. I think many people are simply looking at him wondering, does this guy actually believe what he says? And that is hanging over him. But the bigger problem facing all four candidates, and this is kind of the main point I want to make, the bigger problem is actually not the candidates. The biggest problem is the Conservative Parliamentary Party. That's the problem. So they are operating within an organization, within a structure that is wholly opposed instinctively to doing the things that we need to do in order to regain control of the country, restore our sense of pride, history, and identity, respect the British people, British taxpayers, and fundamentally reshape British politics. The Conservative Parliamentary Party has become more liberal since 2024, not less, since the last election. It's moved further to the cultural left than the average voter. It's sort of way over on the cultural left on issues around ECHR and small boats, leaving all of those things. And that is fundamentally why it doesn't really matter who wins this leadership election, because that leader will be bogged down and hampered by a Conservative Parliamentary Party that will not go far enough in doing the things that I would like to see done in this country to reassert who we are, taking on radical progressivism in the institutions, including the diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda, dramatically slashing legal migration and rebuilding it around much lower levels of migration, but high-skill migration. You will have seen the piece we published this week. It's the third most piece that has been the third most read piece since the beginning of the Substack, showing all this evidence that SW1, Westminster, the expert class ignore, all of this evidence showing exactly the kind of migration that we're encouraging is the most economically costly. That piece has struck a chord with a lot of people for good reason, because basically, you know, you're being lied to by the expert class. And we'll also do what needs to be done in order to stop the small boats and stop the invasion in the Channel. Now, I don't think the Conservative Parliamentary Party is going to deliver on that. I think the brand is basically bust for the next 5 years. I think it's going to be seen as toxic, which brings me to reform. Now, the blunt reality here is, firstly, there should be no pact, there should be no alliance between Reform and the Conservative Party. That is bananas. Just anybody who says there should be a deal doesn't understand the potential for the Reform Party in British politics, because the potential for the Reform Party is enormous, and the Reform Party is not just a tribute act for the Conservatives. The Reform Party should be a party that elevates above left and right. So if you elevate above left and right, the old politics, why would you tie yourself to a dinosaur party on the right wing? It makes no sense. Your pitch to the British people is, we're different from the old parties, we're above left and right, we're not just a tribute act to the Conservatives, we'll go further than the Conservatives on culture, but we'll also go further than the Labour Party on lots of issues around regulation, cost of living, taking on big business, all that sort of stuff. So the potential for reform right now, my working assumption is it's enormous, right? You have a toxic Conservative Party brand. You have a very unpopular incumbent Labour government for the next 5 years. You have immigration as the #1 issue facing voters. That's what they say in the polls. You have the borders out of control. You have crime and lawlessness, a prison system that can't keep pace. You have woke ideology in the institutions, and you have a political class that is across the board unpopular and record low levels of public trust in the institutions, in politics, and so on. There has never been as much space for Nigel Farage and what we might call an anti-establishment party as there is today. So that brings a unique opportunity. But in order to tap into that demand, that's what we'd call the demand side, Reform also need to make a number of supply side changes, which I've written about over the last 10 days, and you will have seen the Substack blog, but I just want to elaborate on a couple of those things, because what I saw at the party conference in Birmingham, where we spoke at the conference, was a professional party. Seriously, it was very professional, it was very impressive, no hecklers, well organized, on time, serious people, lots of donors, lots of big donors, experienced people, business people. I think the people running the party have a sense now of where they want to go, which I don't think was the same actually during the UKIP pre-Brexit era. I think UKIP, I wrote a book on UKIP, Revolt on the Right. I think UKIP gave people a great sense of community and fun, but it didn't quite understand what it meant to run a professional, hard-hitting political party. And that's not a criticism of people who were involved. It's just it never quite matured as a political party. I think in Birmingham, what you saw was a party that was amassing parliamentary experience, 85,000 members, and can now sense that it has a unique opportunity to actually take the fight, not just to the Conservatives, but to both of the parties. And as I've said in the piece, that means opening up a second flank against Labour in northern areas. It means investing in local political activism. It means using the local elections in 2025, the Welsh elections that are rapidly forthcoming, by-elections, to convey its superiority over the Conservative Party. It means making a lot more use of data. It means making a lot more use of data as it prepares for a targeted strategy in 2029. It means basically holding the Conservatives to account on culture, but leaning a bit more into Labour on the economy. I think one of the challenges for Reform, and this is, you know, as somebody that, you know, I think, you know, as it's no surprise to you, I think I broadly share a number of their positions, but on the economics, on globalization, big business, I think they could be harder at hitting big business that is not serving the needs and the interests of the national community. And I think that would help open up that second flank with Labour. So there's enormous potential for Reform. Anybody who's talking about pacts and alliances doesn't understand the potential for that party and should be discounted. Which brings me to Labour. Just before I open up for questions and discussion, I cannot with the exception of Liz Truss, remember a government that has started as badly as the current Labour government. If you want a sense of how badly this government has begun, Keir Starmer's leadership ratings have collapsed by nearly 30 points since the general election in July. So his rating is now minus 26, which is, as I said at the Reform Conference, that is Prince Harry territory, not too far off Prince Andrew territory. I mean, it is a horrific start for a Labour government. And what I think is striking, firstly, is the way in which this hypocrisy, this sense of double standards is damaging the Labour Party brand. You can see that in all the polling. As I wrote last week in the Stack, YouGov asked people to give 5 words or phrases that summarize the Labour Party. Every single one was negative. Dishonest, doesn't share the values of the British people, looking after itself, shouldn't be anywhere near government. I wrote a piece at the beginning of this year, and I said, if Labour win the election, they're going to be one of the most unpopular parties by Christmas that we've seen in recent history. That is exactly what is happening, because the election was a punishment election. Voters punished the Conservatives. They didn't endorse the Labour Party, and the Labour Party has not yet resolved the internal tensions and contradictions that alienate lots of voters. You know, it's way too supportive of migration. It doesn't have a plan for the small boats. It doesn't understand, I think, the intensity of feeling around economic unfairness. It doesn't understand the British people's sense of fair play, something that I've written that will coming out in the next few days. Is it, even if Keir Starmer is acting within the rules, which might be true, he's not acting within the British people's sense of fair play. So culturally, Labour are in completely the wrong place at the moment. And I think there's just enormous opportunity as this government becomes more unpopular. And remember, the economic and demographic context are going to get even worse for Labour. So public service cuts are already baked in. We've got low growth, high debt, lots of expensive debt, high tax. Taxes are going to go up inevitably, unfortunately, because we have this generally incompetent political class. But the demographics are going to get even more challenging for this government. Okay, so over the next, I've already written, over the next 10 years, we're going to have somewhere in the region of 6 to 7 million extra people coming into Britain, most of them from outside Europe. We're going to be maintaining net migration rates of upwards of 300,000-400,000 per year, no matter what government is in charge. That is going to add to this population trap that I've talked about, where the pace of change in the population is so great that it's exceeding the capacity of the state to manage that change. This is happening in Canada, happening in Germany, happening in the UK. You can see it, for example, GP appointments. I think I wrote in a piece this week that migration was responsible for about 7 million GP appointments over the last 8 or 9 years. That's just one example of how this population change is pressuring an already fragile state. So the pressures that are undermining the incumbent Labour government are, in my mind, only going to grow. And the public demand for radical political change is only going to grow over the next 5 years, which is basically, I hate to talk about politics in these terms, but it is an enormous opportunity for people that are advocating a radical departure from the status quo, which is what, by the way, we're doing with our community in terms of ideas and in terms of influencing the national conversation. We are advocating an alternative, essentially, and giving people ideas and arguments that they can use to advocate that alternative. My last point before questions, and then ask me anything, and I'll ask Archie to pull up a few of the questions that are already coming in. Just 2 things you might have noticed. So Robert Jenrick pulls out a plan that is exactly what we advocated in the short film. And Kemi Badenoch then advocates that we should deport people with dual nationality who are involved in the sexual exploitation of young white girls in northern towns at the hands of grooming gangs. Both of those things we were talking about from the end of last year. Yeah, I don't know if they directly came from the Stack, but you know, we're basically ahead of the curve on a lot of these ideas. I don't want to be having to talk about these problems in British society, but it shows that I think the impact and influence that this community is having is much greater than what we see online. I think a lot of people are reading and engaging and digesting the arguments and the data and the evidence that we're making. And I take that as a good sign, because ultimately, I don't care if it's Labour, Conservative, Reform politicians, we're trying to fix the country and make it a better country for our children. And that's fundamentally the most important thing that I care about. So having said all of that, let's open up to some questions and discussion. I've got quite a few questions coming in at the bottom. I'm thinking, aha, I can scroll. Do I think Keir Starmer might not last a full term as Prime Minister? Possible, unlikely. I think he's entrenched. I think the power base within the parliamentary party, the Labour parliamentary party, is entrenched around Starmer. But there are going to be some enormous tests. Here are some things that I think are going to happen. Got a pretty good record generally. Local elections next year, I think Reform have a massive opportunity to hit Conservatives in predominantly Conservative areas, and Labour on current polling will probably be treading water. The crunch for Labour are going to be the Welsh Assembly elections, where looking at current polling, Reform and Conservatives are fairly even, but Reform, I suspect, will edge ahead of the Conservatives in Wales, will probably hit the Labour vote hard. That will pile pressure on Starmer. If the polling remains as it is, I don't think he's going to come under immediate pressure to stand down. But as we go through 2025 into 26, particularly with this deteriorating economic climate, I think inevitably that's going to make life difficult for Starmer. One thing I'm watching for different reasons is when we get those first parliamentary by-elections. Now, we might get by-elections in traditionally Conservative areas, where, again, that will be an optic into how's the Reform Conservative rivalry playing out. But a dream scenario would be getting a by-election in a kind of red wall, working class seat, pro-Brexit, and then you get to really sense whether this second flank and this rivalry between Labour and Reform is going to become one of the key dynamics in British politics. Because don't forget, prior to the 2015 general election, there was a lot of talk about what was called the 2020 strategy for UKIP. And the idea basically was that UKIP would pivot from targeting David Cameron and the Conservatives to targeting Ed Miliband, Chuka Umunna and Labour in lots of Labour seats. Now, of course, in the end, Lynton Crosby and the Conservatives pulled a rabbit out the hat and they won a majority in 2015. But basically that created, that debate, if you like, was stalled. And we never really got to see whether pressure could be applied on Labour consistently in Labour areas. Now, between today and 2029, we get to see whether that's happening through the elections in Wales, by-elections, and then lots of local elections between 2026 and 29 in Labour's northern metropolitan red wall type areas. So Starmer, it's not difficult to see how Starmer starts to really come under pressure. But I think for now, certainly for the next 2 years, he's pretty safe. I'm just reading some of your questions. Sorry, one sec. We've got quite a lot of comments here. Is Suella... Good question. Is Suella Braverman coming over to Reform? You'd have to ask Suella. I think there was an ideal opportunity for her to do that prior to the general election. She chose not to, I think for different reasons. That has perhaps damaged her political capital in the eyes of Reform now. I think what happens here is whether in a national polling, you start to see Reform consistently outpoll the Conservatives. There's 4 points between them at the moment. That's basically the margin of error in national polls. Margin of error is about 3.5 points. So if Reform start to poll ahead of the Conservatives and look like, they're winning local elections, winning by-elections, they become a serious alternative, and you might start to see Conservative MPs defecting, or at least Conservative branches, Conservative councillors defecting. I think, however, to go back to my earlier point about being above left and right, the Reform Party need to think very seriously about who they want in their party, because if you only take ex-Conservatives, you are entrenching that image of yourself as a tribute act to the Conservatives. Now, one of the interesting things I saw at the conference was people like Ant Middleton speaking. Ant Middleton, who I was backstage, I spent quite a bit of time with him. Really interesting guy, former SAS soldier, countercultural, brave, courageous, willing to kind of ask questions about, wokeness and the collapse of our society. He actually gave a really good speech. If you get a chance to watch it, he used the analogy of a sort of SAS battalion or division, or a group of SAS soldiers, and how he maintains that as it relates to a nation. So, you're needing to have a strong sense of cohesion. You can't let outsiders in who don't contribute to the collective good. You have discipline, you have a proud sense of where you're from. It's a very good speech. What struck me about Ant Middleton is here you have a guy who's not in party politics. He's not in Westminster. He has an appeal to 20, 30, 40 somethings. I think there's a real opportunity to bring more people like that into frontline politics, into Westminster, that would make a political movement seem more fashionable, in touch with ordinary people. And so I don't think necessarily just recruiting ex-conservatives should be, the way forward and a priority for reform. Somebody's just said, by the way, CCHQ is a massive problem for the Conservatives. I completely agree. That goes back to the structural point. You could have like the perfect leader in place, but if you've got a parliamentary party that's leaning to the cultural left and selecting parliamentary candidates, Conservative Party candidates, who are, way too socially liberal for Conservative voters, it doesn't make a difference. The flip side to that, by the way, is how Reform manage their internal organization. Because I've written about this. The assumption was always that Reform would infiltrate the Conservatives. It goes two ways. The Conservatives now will try and infiltrate Reform. So Reform have to also maintain complete control over their internal headquarters, office, donor base, branch structures. Otherwise, they risk being diluted and just being turned into the same old centre-right political party. So that internal organisation, I think, is also an interesting one. Can we trust Reform? Somebody says. Nigel Farage says we soften his position. And are Reform listening to people like me? Okay, so just briefly on that. Here's the most important question facing everybody that cares about the country right now. If you care about the country and you want an alternative, my view clearly is there's only one vehicle for doing that. Like I have a lot of time for people who are involved in organizations like the SDP, who are involved in things like Free Speech Union, who are involved in organizations like the Academy of Ideas, this kind of wider ecosystem of people, right? Like I've got so much time for all of those people. But politically, party politically, electorally, there is only one alternative to the big parties. That is the reality. Okay, and that is a Reform Party. Now, you might say it's an imperfect vehicle. You might have quibbles with where it stands on certain issues, but fundamentally, in a first past the post system, there is only one alternative. There is only one alternative to the uni party, if you want to call Labour and Conservatives that. The next question then is, how does that alternative go from 14% to 30 to 35%, which is what it needs to do to win an election or stand a chance at winning an election under first past the post? Well, to do that, it needs to expand its coalition. Now, to expand its coalition, it not only needs to win over ex-Conservatives, it needs to win over apathetic, none of the above voters. That's why Brexit got over the line, by the way, because the Brexit campaign reached into 2.5, 3 million people that don't usually vote. Okay, so a party like Reform would have to do that. It would have to win over a significant number of ex-Labour voters and Lib Dem voters. Many Lib Dem voters, by the way, are very protest-oriented. They're not loyal to the Lib Dems. They just turn to the Lib Dems because they don't like the two big parties. So there's a massive market there as well. And it needs to do all of those things basically at the same time, while not appearing too radical for mainstream, former Labour Conservative voters. So my interpretation of where people like Nigel Farage are going, my interpretation is not the same interpretation as many people who feel very strongly about issues like migration and say, well, Nigel Farage is softening his position. I've never viewed it like that. I look at what he said recently and say, actually, what he's trying to do is get the Reform Party into a place where they can conceivably go from 14 to 30%. Because fundamentally, I don't even think that's about selling out. I don't think it's about diluting. I think that's basically somebody who understands how the first past the post system works. Now, if you want to be a true believer or an ideologue, absolute respect for that. You know, it's not my place to tell anybody where they're, you know, what they should believe and how they think political parties should operate. But I'm about, like many of you, I'm about changing this country. I'm about bringing about serious change. And to do that, you have to think coherently and logically about how you get to 30 to 35% of the vote. Like, this would be so much easier if we were in a, you know, European proportional representation system. You know, I mean, Reform would have probably 30 to 40 MPs. We're not in that system. We're in a very different system, which is how I interpret some of the recent positioning. Should we be concerned when Keir Starmer is cozying up to Europe? Of course. I mean, yeah, I did events, is something I won't say publicly, but just for you guys. I did events with Keir Starmer between 2016 and 2019 in the City of London. There were debates about Brexit and what we should do about Brexit. And I was going into all these sort of, you know, elite institutions saying, well, the people have voted for Brexit, so we should do Brexit. And I thought the hard Brexit, soft Brexit distinction was bananas. For me, Brexit was always like, you know, leaving single market, leave customs union, you know, let's be nimble, flexible, independent, let's be our own self-governing sovereign nation. That's always what Brexit was to me. And I found myself debating people like Keir Starmer, who was then shadow Brexit secretary, kind of arguing that we should have a second referendum because the people didn't vote the first time around. And, you know, he would say things like, you know, they were misinformed, they didn't understand what they were doing. And clearly this was, you know, basically, it was anti-democratic, essentially. And knowing what Keir Starmer's done over the last 6 months, you see many of the same traits. So yeah, I've always been of the view that Keir Starmer fundamentally wants us back in the European Union, views Brexit as a historic mistake, does not believe in the idea that we can be a successful, self-governing, independent nation. And ultimately, like most political elites, Starmer clearly, as you can see in the Freebiegate scandal, and this is a really important point, he derives more status, authority, and legitimacy from his relationships with other elites than he does from his relationship with the people. So this is one of the hallmarks of today's elite. The relationship is horizontal. It's between one elite to another. The relationship should be vertical. It should be from elite to citizen to the people. And Starmer is a classic technocrat managerial elite. Rosie Duffield's comments on Starmer, I thought, hit the nail on the head. I mean, nobody knows leaders like MPs. And what she said quite openly was that this is a guy that is basically managerial, technocratic, not really interested in the forgotten majority. And I see that. And I think the positioning on Europe reflects that. They will sign up if they can to some kind of free movement EU migration pact, without question. Like, here's one example. Why did Keir Starmer give £4 million to Italy to help with the migration crisis? What the hell was that about? It was utterly ridiculous and pointless. And while we're there, why did David Lammy last month give £86 million, £86 million to, you know, tin pot dictatorships in Africa and the Middle East while we're taking winter fuel payments of British pensioners? This to me is, you know, that's £90 million put together. It's completely insane to me. And I think what you see is basically a government that would rather redistribute resources to other countries than give those resources to our own people. And I just think it's a reflection of Starmer's priorities. Do you think, oh, sorry, 1 second. Do you ever worry you're preaching to the converted? How do we get the data, evidence, and arguments about the fiscal negatives of migration to a wider audience? It's a great question. No, we're not doing that. Let me give you a few examples. Maybe Archie, who stood behind me, he can get the numbers on the latest posts on our migration piece. you see those pieces coming into your inbox, and you read them and engage with them. That's step one of what we do. Those pieces then go out on social media. Now, to date, if you look at take the piece showing the economic downsides of migration, that piece currently, Archie's just got the data here. Yeah, so just on Twitter alone, that piece has gone to about 300,000 people who've engaged with it and read it. It's our third most read piece of all time. And we can see people engaging and linking into the studies and actually sharing it. So that's just on one platform. That's 300,000 on X. You then get the Substack community forwarding those pieces on to other people. We've then got the audio visual. We put out a short on that piece, linking to that piece on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, and again on X today. So by the time we're done, a big hitting piece like that that's gone pretty viral will be read by somewhere between 1 and 3 million people. Now, considering this operation is run by me, Archie, and we have some sporadic additional help from people on social, I mean, that's pretty impressive. We can do a lot more, obviously, as we grow, and we will be doing a lot more. But no, I don't think fundamentally we're preaching to the converted. I think these arguments are going out far and wide. And of course, you can help us by sharing the pieces yourself. Let me have a look here. We've got lots of comments. Let me just quickly. Would a Trump presidency help reform? I don't know. I mean, I obviously, my assumption still is that Trump's probably got, a 55% chance of winning. I still think he's the favorite. I think the polling certainly has narrowed, but I think if you look at the swing states, there are 7 swing states that are going to decide the election. Those states are mainly working class. I think he's got enormous advantages in those states. And I think there's probably a lot of shy Trump votes within the polling that aren't currently being picked up. I'm happy to be wrong. One thing we're going to do is we're going to spend the election night, at least a portion of the election night together. We're going to do a Substack live on the election night so we can watch some of the results come in. But let's assume Trump wins. So I think we'll see a number of things. We're going to see a much stronger pro-Israel position. We're going to see much more radical, quick action on Ukraine, a kind of push to resolve that conflict. We're going to have an instinctively skeptical of the European Union president in the White House, somebody who basically thinks the EU is not paying its way, needs to increase defense spending and so on. Agree with that. Instinctively supportive of Brexit, very close with Nigel Farage. That will elevate Farage's position internationally, globally. So I think in that sense, it would be good for him. I think fundamentally, though, the way I look at it, and I was watching the J.D. Vance vice presidential debate, I don't know if you saw it. I think Vance wiped the floor with Waltz. I don't think it was close. I don't believe much of the media commentary on that. I think Vance was superior. But what's interesting is if Trump wins, the arguments and ideas that he's putting forward now, which are quite different in a way from 2016, will increasingly go mainstream. So the idea of patriotic protectionism, actually, this is what I meant earlier on, playing a much more active role at providing incentives for companies, big business, to invest in the national community, to stop offshoring, to stop avoiding tax, to come down hard on our enemies through tariffs and things like that, being tough on border security, introducing the idea much more seriously of deportations. I think J.D. Vance was right in saying you do that through a layered approach. So you begin with foreign national criminals. In the UK, it's not hard to see how we do that. We've got 10 to 11,000 foreign national criminals in our prisons. We've got lots of citizens with dual nationality who have committed crimes. We can apply pressure on those states to remove those people from our country. Not to mention the 1.2 million estimated illegal migrants in Britain already. We could be much more active in doing that. So I think there's an ideas angle to Trump, which would create more breathing space for those ideas and arguments to be had in Western economies. Could you tell us about your upcoming book? I'll just a couple of lines. There's a question about Tommy Robinson. I'll come to that as well. So the book is looking at why I left my full professorship at the university. I'm still an honorary professor and a visiting professor at the University of Buckingham, but I'm no longer teaching and doing admin at the University of Kent. And the book is really about where I think universities are going wrong. And in essence, one line basically is that the universities are being politicized. They're no longer neutral institutions. They're no longer committed to the pursuit of truth, objective knowledge, and exposing students to a diverse range of ideas. The book is basically arguing that they've moved sharply to the left over the last 50 years. I provide lots of evidence for that. They are putting political dogma above scientific knowledge. They are sacrificing free speech on the altar of things like social justice and the new obsession with identity politics. And I talk about what I saw in the universities for 20 years. So it's a sort of, it's part biographical, but also, it's linked very closely with the evidence. Lots of my colleagues would say none of that stuff is happening because they benefit from that political bias. They often lean very strongly to the left. But I also talk about some of the shocking examples that I've seen over the last 20 years, including things like forcing academics to write diversity statements when they apply for research grants and jobs. A diversity statement, you might not know this, but we talk a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. Well, if you're in the universities today, you cannot get a job, you cannot get a research grant unless you submit a side of A4 where you basically pledge your allegiance to DEI. It's called a diversity statement. So little examples like that I'm going to talk about in the book to show people what is really going on in higher education. And that will be out in January. I've had a few questions about whether reform should be engaging with people like Tommy Robinson, whether people like that, like Tommy, should be brought into mainstream politics. Look, my view is this. I've met, we've met each other a couple of times. I think we had a debate on the big questions in 2011, and I interviewed Tommy Robinson or Stephen Lennon for the Sunday Times. My honest view is this. I think, for a start, what became very frustrating for lots of people in the late 2000s is that it was very obvious that issues like the grooming gangs needed to be discussed and talked about. Andrew Norfolk at the Times was one person who drew attention to them, but there were very few people who did that, who were willing to actually put their heads above the parapet and talk about it. I watched Tommy Robinson's interview on Jordan Peterson. He grew up 1 mile down the road from me. He grew up in Luton, well, maybe 5 miles. He grew up in Luton, I grew up in St Albans. I know lots of people exactly like Tommy Robinson with, I know a lot of people from Luton. And I think a lot of the things that pulled him into politics at the beginning, the treatment of our troops, the treatment of children, organized Islamism and gang violence were all things that needed to be talked about by mainstream politics, and mainstream politics was basically ignoring those issues, and that created a vacuum, and Tommy Robinson stepped into that vacuum. My criticism of Tommy Robinson would be that the way, let me put it this way, path dependency matters in politics. So from where you start basically determines your eventual outcome. So if you start in politics with a movement that is seen as being combative, confrontational, violent, thuggish, you are always going to be seen in that particular light. You're always going to be seen in that way. So from where things started with organizations like the English Defence League, I think it's been very difficult subsequently for people like Tommy Robinson to rebrand and find a different place in politics. I think also culturally, one of the realities of Britain or England is that we do not do street politics, street protest, in a way that the French and the Germans and the Italians do. It's just one of the fundamental realities of our culture. And so I think that too has boxed Tommy Robinson into a sort of, into a place that has imposed quite a low ceiling on what he will be able to achieve in terms of impact and influence. And that's just my honest view. I think, so yeah, that's what I think about that. We've got lots of other questions. Have I thought about standing as an MP? To be confirmed. We'll have to wait and see what happens in 2029. I think probably the close readers of the Substack can figure out what is going to happen between now and 2029. I think you can sense the direction of travel, so let's just say that. What else have we got here? Given the takeover of many of our institutions and organizations by radical progressivism or wokeism, how can we make a difference and turn it around? I think if you look at the United States, there's lots of evidence for a serious pushback against wokeism in the institutions. A lot of universities are dumping DEI legislation. A lot of individual activists, by the way, made an enormous difference. So when people say, why are you doing a Substack and building a community? One of the people I always point to is Chris Rufo in the US, who did exactly the same. Chris has got 90,000 subscribers. We've got 57,000. So you're not too far behind, growing very quickly, by the way. Chris has had enormous influence on American politics as an individual. He basically pushed forward anti-woke initiatives in universities and schools. He directly influenced legislation that was brought in under Donald Trump. So you can have enormous influence as an individual activist. That's the first thing that I would say. The second thing is, as we showed with the Higher Education Free Speech Act, which we helped design and deliver, even though Labour are now doing everything they can to get rid of it, if you have a small number of committed individuals, you can make enormous difference. The next thing I would say is if you raise public awareness and visibility about issues, they will mobilize too. So one of the reasons that I took on James Essers, who writes a lot about gender ideology in the institutions. If you haven't read his stuff, by the way, what he's been doing, exposing the Financial Times, BBC, John Lewis, he's got some great stuff coming up on civil service, on schools. If you raise public awareness, firstly, about what's going on, what kids are being taught, what is happening in the NHS, what's happening in government departments, raising awareness in itself is very important. Then giving people a call to action, a place where they can actually lobby their MP or request freedom of information, submit FOI requests. Those things are all critical. Suggesting to political parties anti-woke policies and positions they might adopt, which we've been doing, I think is also about meaningful change. And these policies, I've said this before, particularly with regard to Scotland, many people in London and SW1 would have you believe this is a 50-50 positional debate, that 50% are pro-woke, 50% are anti-woke. That is not true. It's basically closer to 90-10. So if you take an issue like, let's allow children to self-identify with whatever gender they want without, notifying their parents or having very minimal supervision, like that's a 10% issue. Only 10% of people think that's a good idea. And they tend to be radical left progressives who tend to dominate the institutions. But if you can increase the salience of those issues, 80 to 90% of people will break against it. Now, that's what you saw in the US with some of the woke stuff in universities. It's what you saw in Scotland with gender. And it's what you will see in this country if we continue to raise the salience of issues around, Britain is not institutionally racist. Our history is not a source of shame and embarrassment. We should be proud of who we are, proud of what we've achieved. We have zero time for unscientific dogma in universities and schools that says little boys can become little girls and little girls can become little boys. We have no time for that. We think parents should be able to see everything that is used to teach their children. Absolutely. And while we're here, we think every public institution should be providing data and information on what activist groups they're using and bringing in to do training and education. We have basically we're developing a manifesto, an anti-woke manifesto, if you like, of things that we could easily implement in this country. I've got a long list of things we could do around the universities, for example. We've got a long list of things we could do in schools. So there's lots of things that we could be pushing through, but it's a multi-pronged fight. You need basically the SAS of activists, thinkers, influencers, You need the community of people that are supporting those people. You need then the masses who are willing to rally around and make the case themselves in terms of the wider population. But it starts basically with people like us. It starts with communities who are willing to put their head above the parapet, take on something that is very controversial, provocative, whatever, stand their ground, not give an inch, keep going, and demonstrate strength to other people. That is the most important thing. That's why we're in this Substack community, because we're insulated from the institutions, professionally, financially, and that gives you strength and autonomy to stand up and say, this is wrong, you're lying to people, you're not making this information available. One campaign I'm developing at the moment is around data relating to migration, as an example. So we are not making data on welfare claims by nationality and immigration status available to British people. We're not making information on tax credits by nationality and immigration status available. We're not making data relating to crime and imprisonment and reoffending available to ordinary British taxpayers. I think it's absolutely outrageous. It's a campaign that could easily cut through in terms of both the Labour Party and the Conservatives. I should have a piece in the mail tomorrow or the day after on that. We've already put it out in the stack. The misinformation piece has gone to, I think, about 70 to 80,000 people. It's gone around Westminster. Robert Jenrick, interestingly, mentioned the same issue in his conference speech. He also came out and said it's outrageous that the Ministry of Justice is concealing this crime data when other countries like Denmark and so on are talking about it. I think, again, you can see the arguments beginning to cut through. So let's just keep going. Let's just keep going and keep making these arguments. What else have we got here? We've got, do I think the narrative of MSM will present a challenge for reform in the next election? Yes, but it depends how strongly they organise locally. I think if reform get this right, they don't really need to worry too much about the MSM at all. I think they can build their own ecosystem. Konstantin Kisin is in the house. The man himself. You're late, buddy. You're about 50 minutes late. Did Farage's comments on Ukraine hurt? Yes, I think they did. I think you saw a significant drop in the polling, but I think not everything should be polling led. My personal view is Farage was right to ask questions. How does this conflict end? What is the resolution? Because simply carrying on and on and on with lots of guys getting killed and billions of pounds and euros being spent is not an answer. How does this conflict end? In what way does this conflict end? I think that was a legitimate discussion to raise. Not everything should be led by the polling. The debate with Mehdi was spicy. You'll be able to watch it on YouTube, sure. I'll send you the link. But it was very... it was frustrating because I'm trying to have a deeper discussion with people about how we fix the country. And many people on the left are doing this sort of, childish gotcha thing, where you said this in 2016 and then you said that in 2018. I find those debates a bit ridiculous. I really want to have a substantive conversation with people about what's going wrong with the country and how we fix it. So on that note, I had a debate with Ash Sarkar on Monday with the Monk debates. That will be out. We talked about migration. I'll let you listen to it because I think, I think the evidence is basically on my side, our side. If you agree with me, the evidence is now overwhelming. And I think many people on the left of politics are resorting to ad hominem, personal guilt by association arguments because they don't really have anything else. I don't think the evidence is there to support the arguments anymore. So all we need to do, if you think like me, is keep making the argument in a measured, responsible way. Are all universities captured? No. We have new institutions. The Peterson Academy, Jordan Peterson's new initiative, really interesting, not just because he's got countercultural thinkers and academics, but because he's trying to shorten the length of a degree. And I've always asked the question, why have we got students doing degrees over 3 years and being taught on average by 7 or 8 hours a week why don't we do degrees in 18 months and also expose them to a much wider range of ideas? Now, Jordan Peterson got there first, but check out the Peterson Academy. The other thing, by the way, critical thing, the heterodox movement that is happening in higher education in the UK, Professor Eric Kaufman has just set up the Centre for Heterodox Social Science at the University of Buckingham. He's got the first course, I mean, it's crazy to say this, the first course in the UK on the radical left woke movement. You can do it online. I think it's 15 weeks. So you get the lectures, the seminars, all of that stuff. Eric is basically, he left Birkbeck where they tried to cancel him. He's gone to Buckingham. I'm going to be helping his centre. That's going to come out publicly shortly. But the idea is that you're going to be able to teach people about many of the same issues, but on the left, as many of the legacy institutions are teaching people about the right. So we spent all this energy on, you know, debating the problems with conservatism in legacy institutions. Well, we don't talk about the problems with wokeism. And I think that's one of the things that we're going to be doing. We're going to be doing together. Yeah. So a couple of people who are at the Mehdi Hasan debate are just offering some comments as to what they saw, what they experienced there. So I'll let you read those comments yourselves. Sorry, 1 second. Cummings, David Starkey, Liz Truss Badnott pointed to the fact that politicians can't make things happen in the existing system. How do you fix that? Well, let me just finish with this. I think there are a few things we need to do that we are doing on this Substack. One is present, articulate, and spread countercultural messages, arguments, and ideas that are rooted in evidence and that should be picked up by political parties, movements, and campaigners. The second thing we need to do is build an alternative ecosystem through not just this Substack, but lots of podcasts, YouTube shows, new television channels. It's all there. It's all there to be shared. Trigonometry, Unheard, GB News, whatever your politics, there is a new ecosystem that is emerging that we can engage with and support. That's the second thing. And I think thirdly, you're absolutely right. We need to spend more time discussing how we rewire the system, not just the political parties and the politicians, but the bureaucratic administrative state that presides over policy making and decision making in this country. That's one of the reasons, by the way, I brought on Stephen Edgington recently to talk about some of the civil servants who are presiding over this mess. And we're going to continue to do that. I haven't got to all the questions. I'm going to go through all of those questions now. We're going to share this with the rest of the founding and paid community. Just as an outro, I wanted to thank you for your support. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can hit like and subscribe. It will go to people on YouTube way after it goes to founding and paid subscribers. They're our priority. If you have not supported us, please consider doing so, because you help me fund members of my team, Archie, buy equipment, spread the message on social media, etc. I would like you to let me know what you think. Please always feel free to drop me an email. We're also keen to know, do you think we're writing too much? Do you think we're doing too many posts every day? Would you rather have 3 posts or 4 posts? We'd love some feedback from the more committed supporters on that, because that's really important. We don't want to be bombarding you if you're sick of reading stuff, but please let us know your thoughts on that. That would be appreciated. We're going to do this regularly every 2 weeks for founding and paid subscribers. So I'll see you at the next one. If I didn't get to your question this time around, I'm sorry. I'll get to the questions next time. Thank you for your support. I will see you around. I see many of you at train stations, on trains and buses and streets, and you always come up and say hi. So it's great to do that. But we'll have other reasons for meeting up in person shortly, which will be announced as well shortly. Have a great day. Hope you had a good lunch. I hope this worked for you, this format. Let us know what you think. Speak to you soon. Bye-bye.